The funniest thing is that's when you actually catch one. If I actually go hard to catch one, get up at 5 a.m, it doesn't happen. But if I decide to go down for an hour and walk the dog and make a few casts, I'll catch one and be amazed. And then I'll be there every day for a month, try to catch a second one.
Welcome to In the Bucket, the podcast that explores the culture of spey fishing in the Pacific Northwest, a spectacular land of mountains and wild rivers where every cast has a story to tell. I'm your host, Brian Niska.
Hello, everyone. We have a great show planned today. I'm speaking with Dax Messett and Scott Mcgarva. These guys are veteran anglers with long careers in the fly fishing industry, working as steelhead guides, casting instructors, and tackle sales reps. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, so be sure to stick around for great casting tips, advice for a successful fly fishing guided trip experience, and hopefully a fish story or two. Also, we're going to answer the question everyone's asking. What are you supposed to do when a steelhead finally grabs your fly? All right, let's get going. It's time to get in the bucket with Scott and Dax.
Welcome, everybody. I am excited today to be here with my good buddies, Dax Messett and Scott Mcgarva. Scott, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what you've been up to?
Well, Brian, thanks for having me here. This is a fun opportunity to chat with some friends about our lives and what we do. I'm a fishing tackle manufacturer's representative now after a varied career of guiding, retail guiding, and being a skateboard rat. So, now I still wish I was on the river more, but I now schlep fishing tackle.
How about you, Dax?
Oh, I've been similar to Scott. I've been a guide since the year 2000 and worked in the industry in some capacity since then. I also do a bunch of hosted trips every year. And in this last year, I took on a new position as the U.S. sales rep for a cool company from Sweden called Nom Products. And on top of all that, I try to be an advocate for the watersheds that I work on and visit, and involved in as many conservation issues as I can be, to give back to the resources that have been good for me my whole career.
Right on. It's nice to see people, stay within the industry. I remember years ago when I was guiding in Chile down on a river called the Futalafu, one of the clients, we were sitting on the bench after fishing. He turns to me and said, "So what are you going to do when you grow up?" kind of thing. And I was like, "Buddy, I'm doing it. What do you think I'm going to do? This is it." So it's great to see, top guides, industry professionals like yourselves meander your way through middle age, still doing this. And I mean that with the greatest respect, because I think we're all in a pretty similar age bracket. And it's a very unique age bracket because, especially you, Scott, you are old enough to have fished in the 70s and the 80s. So you remember what that was like. But you're young enough to still be relevant to the kids of today. And you guys are still out there doing it. So I think the three of us are uniquely positioned age-wise as sort of this sounds a little bit grandiose, but purveyors of the culture. I think in a lot of ways, middle-aged guides have really shaped that. And Dax, in particular yourself, I know you've guided all over, but give me a quick little short list. Bang out the places that you've guided in your career.
Started out in Northern California and eventually branched out to New Zealand, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Montana a little bit, and I've hosted trips, as you know, to your place, which is probably my favorite, to several places in British Columbia, Belize, New Orleans. Redfish is my newest thing the last 4 or 5 years, which is super fun. And Bolivia is also a super fun one for the Golden Dorado. So in terms of guiding and travel and doing everything from working for lodges, for working for outfitters, to having my own outfitting business overseas, I have a lot of what you would say, I think, rich life experience, but I never got rich doing any of that, as I'm sure you guys would agree with. But I think Bob Marley said something about that when some interviewer asked if he was rich, doing this his whole life. And he said, "What do you mean by that?" And he said, "Money and bank accounts and cars and whatnot." And he said, "I'm rich in life experience." And I think when I look at the three of us here, that's how I feel about choosing this career path and as you were saying, Brian, if you asked me when I was 25, when I started, I wouldn't have said, when I'm in my 50s, I'm still going to be doing this. It just happened that way because I guess everything's kind of been so fun, and I'm grateful and fortunate to just keep meeting the right people and finding these opportunities and staying in the business this long.
Right on. Hey, Scott, how about you? Where have you been guiding?
Well, if I back up, when I was right out of high school, my dad lived in Alberta, and so I was a big Bull River fan. And after high school, I thought, what am I going to do with my life? I'm going to go be a fishing guide, at least for the first few years. And so I was on the bow. I was kind of in the middle stage of the guiding development there, second wave, if you want to call it that. Did that for a few years. And then, in the winter was working in the ski business. And then, really went into retail for a long time. And I did the retail thing for 12, 15 years before I went back to guiding. And then as the retail thing went away, I basically fell back to guiding because it was something I could do pretty turnkey, pretty easy. There was opportunities out for me. I needed to pad my bank account again and go do something. And I really wanted to go do something that, frankly, I just knew I could do, like proverbial blindfolded, right? So I went back to guiding, and I started in the ocean, guiding, for saltwater Chinooks and cohos. And then very quickly got an opportunity, really through you, Brian, actually, was up on the Bulkley running raft trips in the canyon. And that morphed into working for that Bulkley operation, a whole bunch of different facets, from managing lodges on the Maurice to going and managing lodges on the Babine. And then following season, had an opportunity to go to the Dean, and I was on the Dean River for a bunch of years. I did like the ocean, but I really preferred the river. Ocean guiding it's fun, it's big boats, lots of people. It's almost like a college campus for people, but I prefer the river and the peace and quiet of the river and the guests on the river. River guests, they really are often true anglers, I've found, particularly steelheading. You do get some newbie guys, but a lot of guys are passionate and big influencers on your life, you find, when you reflect on it. You're funny mentioning guys asking, hey, what are you going to do with your life, son? They're sort of envious of your life, but at the same time, you're envious of theirs because they can afford to come to these places, right? So that went on for a while. And then, I slowly kind of morphed away from guiding into the rep work just because I needed to be home. I had a child at a lot later life stage than most, and I wanted to be home for that. And so that's what sort of moved me away from it. But I still enjoy it, and I still do guide part-time. I do look forward to it, and I guide a little bit locally here and there. But, for the most part now when I go guiding, it's exciting because I'm not in the trenches, like the old days where you got to put up with the crappy weather and the shoulder seasons and all the problems of guiding that people don't hear about. It's not always about catching big fish, and it's, why is the water pump not working anymore? Or, things like that. So here I am now, wish I could go do it more often, but I'm happy with what I do.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to get into some guide stories, but why don't you tell everybody listening the brands that you currently are representing?
So I work with an agency in Eastern Canada, and we cover all of Canada for Sims. I cover Western Canada for G. Loomis and Shimano, and Shimano Canada, which is also Power Pro Braid, and Jackal, which is a lure company. And then we also do Mayfly Group, which is Ross Reels, Able Reels, and Airflow fly lines. And then independently, I do Lamson products, and I work for a distributor out of Quebec, and we distribute Montana Fly, Regal Vices, a whole litany of fly tying related stuff, hooks, you name it. So it gives me a good broad selection of brands to do. And a lot of my customers are, supporting me on multiple brands. So that's really important because, the repping business is all about your relationships with people and dealers. And so, once you got your foot in the door there, it's nice to have a lot of different brands to work with them on.
I think this style of repping, where you have a rep who's actually got a lot of miles on the river, is somewhat new. I think traditionally your rep was the traveling salesman guy, and you talk about relationships. Scott, I've known you a long, long time, and I can tell the people listening that you're not just a fly fisherman. You're an expert in a variety of tackle types, ranging from ocean fishing to float fishing on the river to lake fishing. You probably honestly are the most well-rounded angler I've ever met who is still out there fishing. And, talking about some of those brands that aren't necessarily fly specific, I think it's very unique to have someone like yourself who can teach a Spey casting lesson at a very, very high level, but also can show someone how to properly spool up their spinning reel. And name a species, you probably caught it. I remember as a much younger person, when you talked briefly about your hiatus to retail, obviously at one point you had your own store, which was fantastic, really changed the game in Vancouver. But previous to that, you were a fixture at Barry's Bait and Tackle, selling dew worms and roe as well as fly stuff and everything. But I think what you were most well known for there was the Barry's Bait and Tackle phone-in fishing report.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yeah. It was a free phone-in service back when we didn't have the smartphones and the internet wasn't really what it was. And you'd call in and you'd hear a 5-minute blurb of me telling you what was going on in the local fisheries, from everything from regulation to fish politics to, opportunities, and trying to balance it. Like, you didn't want to tell people what rock to go stand on in the river, but you wanted to deliver a service. And from the retailer point of view, it was a huge time saver, because people want to, call the tackle shop and find out, hey, what's the hot fishery? And we would just redirect them to this telephone fishing report. I think it was well over 500,000 calls a year when I left it, which is, if you think about every guy phoning a store and, even if you cut that number by 70, 80%, for repetitive calls, it's still well over 100,000 people that are, being serviced to listen to that aren't necessarily calling the store. And it was funny because people would start calling me personally after and complaining if the thing wasn't updated often enough for their liking. So free service, I'm going to complain about your free service. But it was very good. And I appreciate the unique thing about Vancouver and the Lower Mainland is a lot of the big tackle shops are hybrid shops, meaning that they sell all manners of tackle. And I think that's also because a lot of the anglers, and particularly in BC, they're varied anglers. They fish the salt, they fish the river, they fish the lakes, they Spey fish. And so they're not, I won't say put off, but, they go into a tackle shop like Barry's, or there's lots of other great ones, Sea Run, Fred's, that offer a variety of expertise. And that's just the way the model works. I know in the U.S. side, talking with my friends in the U.S., and Dax can expand on this, it was much more fly shops versus tackle shops, bait and tackle shops. And you didn't go to a bait and tackle shop for fly gear. And that model, I think it's because of our populations in BC, that model, we do have some excellent fly shops in BC, but the model of the hybrid store really works because we just don't have the population to support a lot of fly shops. Density wise, they've come and gone, but the long-term shops that are there sell everything. And you can go in there and get advice on everything from how to thread a herring to how to tie a size 18 chironomid, and that expertise level, is really important. And it's a challenge for the stores now to get staff and keep staff because, of course, what you said at the outset about, hey, buddy, you want to work in a tackle shop your whole life is a challenge for them.
Scott, what do you remember what years that phone-in fishing report would have been active?
It ran from about 1995 or so, right up to when I left there in about 2003. So, it was 7 or 8 years. It changed. It was done by the Talking Yellow Pages, right? I don't even have a Yellow Pages anymore. I don't think I've had a Yellow Pages in my house for a decade. And it was the Talking Yellow Pages. And when they started to wrap up, because the internet was taking over, it was the only service the Talking Yellow Pages they continued using it even after they discontinued the actual service of Talking Yellow Pages. They still had Barry's fishing report. They still had the hardware and they allowed it to happen. Of course, I think it's gone now, but that's how big it was. And what was funny about it is that there was no advertising revenue. Like what Barry's paid for it to have it was really small. It wasn't like there was an advertisement at the start or at the end. We could use it to plug our own advertising. Like if we had a sale coming up or something, I could make a mention. But it was never done as a vehicle to promote the store outside of promoting expertise. And, that's fishing reports are they're a tough one for shops now. I can think of a well-known store in my locale that does a great fishing report, but they also get a lot of heat for a fishing report because the way the internet has changed expectations and blown out spots that, people are concerned that we're giving away too much free information, that anglers don't learn on their own anymore. They expect to be told where to go find instant success. And that troubles some people. People are like, man, guy needs to earn it, and instead you're drawing him a map and telling him where to stand. And, that's just the way the business has changed.
Kids these days. Dax, I know your style is a little bit different. You're pretty much a fly-specific guy, probably been that way your whole career. I think that you're building your rep business sort of one individual at a time through casting lessons and, the fact that you yourself are an expert instructor, expert caster. You bring credibility to a brand that isn't as familiar in North America as perhaps it is in Europe. Walk me through how you've been able to pull this off in such a short time.
Again, back to just being grateful to a lot of it's a relationship-based business, I guess we would all agree on. From the time I started guiding in Truckee, California, when I was just a snowboard bum, ski bum, like we all were, I cultivated a lot of really good relationships in the guide industry, and then later with lodges, and then with reps. And I never really sought out to be a sales rep, but it kind of went naturally with what I was already doing. Between the guiding and my affiliations with outfitters and relationships with shops and doing demos and doing club presentations, even through COVID, I still do quite a few club presentations. I actually have one tonight here that I do on Zoom. So I'm able to do presentations to these clubs all over the country without having to physically go there. So I interact just either in person or those types of presentations with probably over 500 anglers a year. So they're all pretty curious as to what products I'm using. And so when I started with NOM, you kind of, again, that relationship that we have kind of steered me to that opportunity. I just got done hosting a trip on the Dean and came to host a trip at Spey, Brian's place. For those that don't know, check it out. And I needed some new shooting line, and Brian brought out 3 different kinds of shooting line, and he pointed to one that he recommended that I never heard of before and didn't really say much about it. And I went and used it for the next week, and I was just blown away by it. I thought it was the best product like that I've ever used. And so he gave me Marcus's info, the owner of the company in Sweden, and I reached out to him, and he reached out back to me, and we had a great conversation. And him and Logan Landry, the partner in Eastern Canada of NOM, came out, and we fished the Rogue together, and it was just, man, jamming, casting, talking about the industry, talking about rod design, rod development. And this is after they sent me some rods to try. And there's a lot of great rods out there right now. You're not going to exist if your rods aren't very good. And I was just blown away by the rods I tried. And again, they had this shooting line I was just blown away by, and they offered me the rep job. They didn't have one yet for the States, and they kind of talked me into it. And I looked at it as an incredible opportunity to start with a really cool company on the ground level and be a part of building that and growing that down here in the lower 48, and kind of merging the Scandinavian two-handed casting and Atlantic salmon fishing with Pacific Northwest steelhead fishing. And, NOM, by the term of it's a Norse term that means always learning, and we just don't know yet. And so instead of being all arrogant and whatnot, we're trying to bridge those two communities and be humble and make really good products. And it's something I'm really stoked to be a part of. And the longer I've been guiding and hosting trips, I just want to use whatever the best products that are available to me. And the rods happen to be there at that right time. And so is the shooting line. And so is our monofilament that we were talking about. So, and any other brands that I pick up as this keeps going, that's also what I want to be using. I don't have plans really to slow down my guide calendar and host a travel calendar in the immediate future. But the rep thing is Scott and all my other good buddies in the industry that are full-time reps, they'll scoff at that, like, you need to dedicate as much time as possible because it takes up a lot. I think I'll scale back on the guiding as we move forward and NOM gets bigger and bigger, and we're set up to have a pretty phenomenal year this year. So like Scott said, I still am going to be grateful for that time on the water, and we'll just see how that balance between guiding and hosting and doing shows goes with the rep thing.
Yeah, it's it's tricky as you get older because, for myself with kids and being married, you don't get as much time fishing. And when you are fishing, you should be working on your job, guiding, etc. Right? So for me, I think back to those days when I lived in Squamish and I spent more time fishing, I think, than not fishing. But you still have that. You still have that knowledge base. And for each of us, I think we all started Spey fishing in the 90s, which doesn't sound like that long ago, but shoot, that's pushing probably 30 years. And it's been a really neat 30 years to be a two-handed angler. We've seen, a trend towards shorter rods. We've seen rod actions not necessarily get better or worse, but we've seen them diversify. So as an example, my own trajectory, I went from sage to loop, and I thought, light and fast was where I wanted to be. And then I realized that as a casting instructor, I could sum up my job to someone by saying, hey, most of the time I'm telling people to slow down. Why do I need to tell them to slow down? Why are they going too fast? Well, the reason that they're applying power too quickly is everybody's natural reaction when they feel load leaving the rod is to add speed. And when we're Spey casting, we want to apply power progressively, like any fly cast. And if we apply power too soon, what do we hear, guys?
Whoosh.
Exactly. You don't even need to be looking. So for myself, with Pirouet and the metal detector rods, I really wanted a rod that would hold a bend right down through the cork. Dax, I know the stuff you're fishing right now. You're going for that crazy light feeling. Scott, what are you fishing these days? What do you like?
Well, of course I do. I'm a G Loomis guy now, and I've been through what you pointed out, a wide variety of Spey rods over time, and I probably still have 8 different companies represented in my closet of graphite. But the rods I'm casting now, the NRX Plus Spey rods, they are definitely pushing for the lightweight. They are faster in hand. They're not quite as fast as some of the Euro style rods, but they're not as soft as the previous. Loomis at one point, they manufactured 3 rod actions trying to satisfy the 3 demographics, right? We had the very soft Skagit rod. We had the middle flexing. They called it kind of the English Devon type rods. And then we had the very fast Euros. And as the markets kind of changed, they've kind of morphed it into one action. And I would definitely say NRXs are, on the faster side, compared to the older rods. And it was interesting when you talked about that with Spey rods is, the Spey rod market, we've seen more change in the Spey rod market the last 20, 30 years than Spey rods saw in the 30 years before that by a mile, right? Particularly with lines and how lines match rods and what you mentioned about how people feel load and when I first started Spey casting, it was double tapers and there was a couple of real new weight forwards out there, but they were what I would call quite long bellies compared to what we use now. And that's what we had to try to learn on. And it was horrible compared to what new anglers entering the market now, for them to try and learn on as far as, the short heads and easy loading rods. So, do I still like the older rod styles too? Yeah, I find them all really interesting. If I go dig out an old Sage Brownie or CND or Winston, they all have a different action, and it takes me about 3 or 4 casts to get used to them. But I enjoy them all for different reasons, right? Obviously, being a Loomis guy now, that's sort of going to be my go-to rod when I go out in the river. But yeah, as you also know, Brian, I've got quite a case full of old hardy reels, and they all have these giant feet on them. And I like to use them as much as well, except they don't fit any of my rods. So if I want to go take a reel out for a spin, I got to go find an old rod where I built it to fit that reel. And so last spring, I found myself digging out an old 7136 Sage Brownie, the original one, with 3 inches chopped off the tip intentionally to help it pull heads out of the water, with a Skagit line and this old Perfect I had. And I forgot just how nice and smooth and easy that rod was to cast. And I'd venture to say if I handed that rod to 90% of the guys out there right now, they'd claim it's uncastable. They'd say, oh, this thing's a noodle. It's terrible. And you're like, no, man, you're going too fast. You're hitting it too hard. Relax, slow down. So
love that rod.
Great rod. Yeah. And guys are like, well, why do you still have those? I'm like, well, I'm never going to give them up.
Nope.
My other favorite old rod is an old 13-foot 8-weight GLX Loomis rod that remember Laurie, Brian, Alberta Grand Prairie Laurie, guy we were guiding, Dax. He gave it to me as a tip because I told him it was an amazing rod and why wasn't he using it? And he had lots of rods, so he gives it to me. And I love that rod, but it's definitely the other end of the spectrum. It's a faster, Scandi action type of action. But everything, they're all, like you said at the outset, Dax, they're all great. When they're in that high end, they're all great for something. Is it a Ferrari? Is it a Porsche? Is it an Aston Martin? They're all beautiful, but to each their own as far as what they use. So, that's my long-winded way of saying what rods I use.
I want to mention, Scott, it's a real common thing, right? People want to fish these old reels, and the problem with the foot not fitting into modern rods. Jeff Peerway's been running into that quite a bit, but what he's been doing is building special butt sections for people to accommodate those cool reels that they want to fish. I got to be honest, I never really have fallen into that wanting to fish an antique reel. I'm more of a, hey, I want to fish the latest and greatest tech on the reel side. Reels are such a personal thing, aren't they?
Very much so.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it came from, I was a center pin guy and I was a Silex guy. And to me, that personified what a steelheader was, when I was a kid growing up on the Capilano River. The hardcore guys that you looked up to all had old Silexes and cork floats. And I mean, that was really the river where float fishing really almost was invented, if you want to get into historical history. And that's what I was a broke ass kid. I remember buying my first Silex, at a tackle shop for $300 and being so proud of it. And there's all these old pictures of me. I could go find one in my office with my oilcloth jacket and my pintail vest and my Silex. And that told me that I was at that level. And interesting enough, center pins kind of went away. And now, of course, it's a huge revival in BC. And it's really catching on in the States now, that a center pin. So it's becoming huge. And
Ontario too.
And Ontario, yeah, where it's been the route in Ontario forever. And so that meant I already had a natural inclination to use old reels. And so when I started fly fishing and spey casting more and more and more, I gravitated towards, old spey reels, and the Hardy Perfect obviously was one of the more sought after ones. And because I was in the tackle business, I would come across them, with more frequency than most. And so I was slowly amassing, a selection of these reels for application. But as you mentioned, Brian, they all had these long feet because of the way the old bamboo rods were built. And, to convert a foot to a smaller foot on a reel, it's the same kind of price as converting a rod to a reel seat that will accept it. So, depending on what you want to do, the thought of stripping a handle off a perfectly good spey rod seems odd, but also the thought of taking a vintage reel and taking the foot off to substitute a smaller foot is equally odd. It's just really where you want to throw your money. And the nice thing about having a case full of old perfects is the one thing that's good about them, they don't depreciate. So that's how I could always justify buying more, because I wasn't going to lose money on them, right? I wasn't going to lose money on them. So whereas old rods, they're only ever going to depreciate, if you're worried about that kind of thing. But with reels, that was always my justification to buy more. And to this day, my girlfriend's like, why are you buying another reel? I'm like, 'cause.
So you're saying that fishing tackle is an investment?
Old fishing tackle, I think, is an investment. A bit like, angling art. Maybe that was my justification for it, but yeah, it is, and it's a conversation piece too. People talk about old reels and they're kind of cool and it's something you can fiddle with at home. And I always remember on the Thompson, I watched a guy on the Thompson across just below the highway bridge, at Murray Creek, which is the top of the graveyard. I watched a guy look at me, stare at me for a while. I thought he was mad at me, but he's a mile away on that river. He walked up, he crossed the highway bridge. He walked down to the corner of the graveyard, which is a long hump, and walked right up to me to ask me about my reel, because he could see from across the river that he thought he was looking at something old and vintage, and he'd never seen one, and he wanted to talk about it. And I always just laughed and said, you came all the way over here to look at a reel? I'd see you at the pub later. He goes, no, I had to know. I had to see what you had and what you were using. And, that just goes to show you people's passions about things.
Dax, what are you fishing for reels these days?
Well, it's funny. I just last week, and some people will scoff at it, I just started looking at Spey pages for the first time in a lot of years. And
Yikes.
I know, one of your favorites, but I'm just curious as to what's out there. And I posted a question. It's so funny you brought this up. I said, okay, what do you prefer for steelhead? Click and pawl or seal drag? And so I'll let everybody just go on there and read through the dozens of different comments. And I didn't say what I liked one way or another. I don't have a dog in the game or anything. But for me personally, for my steelheading, I like a reel that makes some sound. And for my saltwater fishing, I like seal drag because, I want to land that fish a lot faster than I want to fight a tarp, and I want to get them as soon as possible, permit, all that sort of stuff, bonefish. And where I think the click and pawl, it's just more of a natural, we're already fishing for a super hard to catch fish in the most challenging way possible. And other than the reels being cool and collector's items down the road, like Scott said, an investment, I really like that. It's just more the mono thing, whether it's an old Hardy or some of the newer reels that I really like. I love Schamberg's reels very, very much. I love VR design reels. Those are kind of my two favorite, but I also, I got at least 10 Hardys floating around from all everything from a 1926 to the modern Bouglé. So I like the reels and also I fish for steelhead with my tip raised as opposed to having a loop. So I like the reel to naturally push that tip up. And I also like the balance of a heavier reel. And the seal drag reels tend to be light because that's what they're going for, light reels. And so unless they do something like a solid frame, it's not going to have enough weight for me to give me that angling aspect that I enjoy with the weight of it naturally pushing it up. Many of them, not all of them.
Dude, I absolutely agree. I think most people are fishing with reels that are too light. I hate that feeling of always fighting to keep the tip up. To me, if you're not fishing with your tip up, you're not really fishing. You're just along for the ride. And to properly present the fly, you need to be able to, work with the rod tip elevated. And also, I like the way the rod casts when you have a bit of extra weight in the reel. Personally, these days, and like you guys, I've got a bunch of different reels, but the ones I find myself using it's actually an Islander reel designed for saltwater conventional fishing, but we get them customized a little bit. The model's a TR3 full frame, which is absolutely what you want if you're using mono running line. And it's a heavy son of a gun, but it keeps the tip up, and I'm loaded for whatever I hook with that thing. So it's, once again, it's a personal thing, but I'm hearing Scott's argument, and I'm thinking I need to go downstairs and talk to my wife about my retirement package and load up on a bunch of old Hardys.
Brian, you have Bouglés, don't you? I mean, you used to. I remember you used to have a 4-inch Bouglé in your kit.
You know what? I'm ashamed to say that I have sold some old reels over time because I wasn't using them, but I also have boxes of stuff that I haven't looked at in ages. So maybe I should go and set up a garage sale or something, make some space. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting what Dax was saying, the old reels and the attraction. I totally agree. I mean, Dax and I both spent quite a bit of time on the Dean, and I remember a quite well-known steelhead anglers asking me how I could fish with a click and pawl in lower Dean because the fish were just so hot and they would strip you so quickly. And even a perfect with the heaviest salmon check on it would just look like it was on free spool, when fish were leaving, and hard to slow them and how to put some brakes to them. And I looked at him sometimes they run away and smoke me. And maybe if I had a big disc drag, maybe I could have turned them. Maybe not. I've seen lots of guys get smoked there on disc drags too, right? But the sound, and the click and everything about it. And I agree. I mean, in the salt, it's a whole different game. I don't use them in the salt, obviously, mostly for that. And the weight, like you said, the attraction of the weight is there. I just ordered a Chris Henshaw reel, speaking of more modern makers, just because I wanted a hand-built reel, Schamberg's reels, I've looked at his reels and others that are making contemporary click pawl stuff. They're all beautiful. They're all works of art. I'd love to own every one of them, but one step at a time here.
One other fun little thing about the click reels is they all kind of have their own song, right? And so one of the things is Steelhead guides that every client asks us, so when one eats it, when do I set the hook, right? And it's impossible really to answer. To be fun here in everybody's answer, but when you use a reel enough, it has a certain song to it. When it's time to compress that, it's when it's time to get them, right?
Yeah, true.
Since you brought it up, Dax,
this got to be good.
You got to tell me, what should I do when one grabs it? What do you tell people?
I want to hear you. I want to hear your version.
Okay. I think what needs to be said first is that it's not going to be a consistent answer from one client to the next. Okay. I've gone through many different plans, if you will, carrying the loop, which can go very well or can go very bad. I've gone from keeping the drag turned down nice and loose and wait until it's spinning, which works well, but can also go very bad. I've gone to now the situation where, well, here, let me back this up for a second and say, what's funny to me is when you steelhead fly fish, you're going to lose a lot of fish. And when you steelhead fly fish, you're going to blow a lot of chances. Years ago, someone came up with the term farmed. You're sitting around with the guides at the end of the day. How did Scott do? Oh, your client farmed one, or Dax's guy farmed two. We say this with a certain level of disdain, but also some sympathy because we've all been there. But here's the thing that I find interesting. When you have someone who's truly green, someone who hasn't done a lot of trout fishing or bass fishing or really any fishing, they have a really high success rate on turning bites into hooked fish. Now, they lose a lot after that point, but they do pretty good with getting them on the line. And I think it's because they just don't do anything. They're like, what's going on? There's a fish leaving. So I think there's a lot to be said for do nothing. And these days, what I try and do is get most of my people to just drop their rod or point their rod towards the fish if they're going to do anything. But once again, at times I've used holding a loop with great success. At times I've used turning down the drag. But this also goes into the equipment they're using, right? So that's what I do. How about you guys?
I say generally, when the fish eat your fly, don't interrupt them.
Ooh.
No, I like that one.
It's okay to catch this fish. We've done all this casting, sometimes for days. You finally get the eat. It's okay to catch them. It's okay they jump around. They do all kind of cool stuff. They look cool if we land them. But what a lot of people tend to do, especially people that do a lot of bobber fishing from a boat where they set the hook 97,000 times a day, their first inclination when they feel something happen is to rip the rod tip straight upstream, interrupt the fish that's trying to turn into the current, and they pull it away from them. And it's amazing how often that happens. So yeah, I like to say don't interrupt them. If it's a guy that I fish with that has interrupted them multiple times, as we're getting into the bucket, let's say, I might say be a little more curt and say something like, if a fish eats it, please don't fuck it up.
Do you think a lot of your guests enjoy your humor, Dax? I mean, I honestly believe you could do well as a stand-up comedian, but do you think that's part of the attraction to fishing with you?
God, it must be. I don't know why they keep coming back.
They love the abuse.
Yeah, I'm pretty booked for years to come, so that's good, I guess. If they don't like it, then they don't have to go. You don't have to go with me. I send invites to all my guide stuff. It's invite. I have a website or whatever, but I don't get any trade from that. It's more like a business card if you want to look at. But all my stuff, thank goodness, is either referrals from other guides or clients or invites. So other guides, when I work with them, sometimes go, I can't believe you said that to that guy. So if I'm not talking to the client, I probably don't like you. So maybe it's a good thing if you're on the other end of my sometimes sarcastic instruction manner.
Well, I guess if I'm going to chime in, I mean, I think, I've had Brian kind of outlined it. I can think of lots of different fun steelhead stories of somebody not doing it the right way or, a change up from what they've always done. And I agree with both you guys. I think there's a time and place for everything. I think if I was fishing in faster, streamier water, I tell the guy, let the fish hang himself. It's fast water. He's got to move for the fly. if it's, in slow hang down situations in colder water, when you've got more, every situation an angler, is a little bit different to try to do it. I do like, my rod there and you feel the fish. I like, the reel goes click, click, click a few times. It's interesting. A fish will pull line off your reel. A snag won't really do it the same way. That the suddenness of something taking it, but it perplexes people. What do I do now? And particularly if you're at the elbow of the guest. I mean, if the guest is upriver or downriver and you're far away, you're not really coaching them. But I remember, a comment that a guy made to me about up in BC that, we don't coach as hard because we're lucky to have a bit more fish. So there's more opportunities for the guest to learn by experience. So if a guy farms a fish by setting the hook, well, when he gets another bite in 20 minutes, he figured out that didn't work. So maybe I should do what the guide said. And, when in doubt, trust your guide and let the fish take it a bit, as opposed to when it's the only opportunity he's going to get all day and you're not there to make sure he capitalizes on it. And therefore being at his elbow, you literally see the fish take before he does, so that you're able to basically, grab his arm and stop him from ripping its head off to pull out some line, and everything in between, right? I remember when I was fishing on Haida Gwaii, we fish a lot of these smaller rivers and it's buckets. And you can't drop a loop in the bucket to the fish because he's just holding in the current. He's not turning away to go anywhere. And a really good client I'd guided for years on the Bulkley and the Babine, kept dropping loops at him. And I kept going, what are you doing that for? He's not going anywhere, right? He's not going to turn back. And, just hold your line tight and let him eat it a bit and then set the hook. And he went from missing about 6 to getting about 6. And he looked at me like, well, that sort of goes against everything I've ever done. And I said, well, it's not about changing your technique completely. It's modifying your technique for the water you're on, and this small bucket water, that fish just sat there and grabbed your fly. He didn't move 6 inches for it, whereas obviously summer runs are way different animal, they're moving for your fly and it's just different. But trying to get the guest to understand what's going on. And, that said, there's obviously going to be situations where it didn't work out as planned. So
I love it when they blow it and then they turn to look at you and say, what happened?
Right. And one other thing to go to that kind of goes back to the click reel. Because I love when clients bring their own stuff and that's great, but especially for winter steelheading, I have like 6 rods rigged up with 6 different things, right? For each application, whether we're floating down the river or jet boating or whatever, you're not using the same tip or head for that matter. So anyway, all my rods are set up with some type of click reel. So clients, when I hand it to them, some of them look at the reel and they're instantly intimidated. They're like, oh my God, like I'm used to using a seal drag with, what do I do if a fish eats it? And my favorite answer is I'm like, well, that'll be a good dilemma. Then we could figure it out. That's a good thing. Learning on the fly. And like what Scott was saying, some fisheries and some days you're going to have more opportunities than others. So it's a good dilemma to everybody listening out there when you hook one, and then you just learn from that. And that's why steelhead fishing isn't like a one-trip thing. It's a lifetime of experiences that you put together as a steelheader, as opposed to, oh, I went to the Bulkley. I'm not going there again. I didn't have a good trip. Well, maybe you got to go another year. Maybe conditions weren't good. Or I went to the Deschutes. I didn't get nothing for 3 days. Oh, that river's no good. Maybe the angler's no good. But anyway, conditions, are going to dictate fish being around. Sometimes conditions are perfect and they're still not there. So think of steelhead as a moments game, not a numbers game. And it's a lifetime of experiences instead of just lumping it into one day. And that's part of a tangent I could go on is a lot of the new anglers to steelhead fishing, if their first experience is just, in a drift boat covering a 20-mile beat with 3 beads and pencil lead on it, trying to hook as many fish or as many trees as possible, that's probably not the best way to go about developing your philosophy on steelhead fishing. I'll get off my box now, Brian.
Hey, we're going to talk some more about beads, those bead chucking, bobber watching, and the toilet seat. I want to go back to the toilet seat. But before I do, I just want to make a point that when I look at our lineup of guests for In the Bucket, I see this one theme that's pretty prevalent. And I actually think it's throughout steelhead fishing, in that there's a lot of folks that really get into steelhead fishing who also love to ski and snowboard. It's shocking, the common ground there. And I think, to me, a big part of that is, if you're a skier and you want to ski powder, you can't do that off the calendar. That's a conditions thing. And a lot of times it's a patience thing. And it's understanding when to go. And steelhead fishing, there's a certain element of luck. Sometimes it's good to be lucky, and sometimes you're luckier if you're good. But when it all comes down to it, if you find yourself in the river and conditions just happen to be perfect, probably going to have a good day. And it's probably even a situation where the river's not going to be full of people, because most people want to wait until they hear that the river's good. They're not willing to make these calls on their own and be ahead of the curve. So with all that being said, I want to just very quickly, Dax, you're a snowboarder, aren't you?
Yep.
Oh, man. Scott, I know you're a skier. We've skied together before, but Dax, you talked about snowboarding in California. I don't watch a lot of movies these days, but
Me either.
a couple weeks ago, my wife and I threw on this documentary. I think it's called Buried, but it's about the unfortunate avalanche in 1982 at Alpine Meadows. And honestly, it's probably one of the top 3 or 4 documentaries I've ever watched in my entire life. That thing is so well done. And for people that were skiing in the 70s and the 80s, it's, to see the style back then and just get a feel for what the culture was like. And then nowadays you see, what's coming out of especially big resorts like Whistler and Vail with huge lineups, and kind of makes you a little bit nostalgic for the past. But obviously, that was a real tragedy that happened. But Dax, that's your neck of the woods, isn't it?
Yeah, Alpine Meadows was actually the second ski resort I worked for when I moved to Tahoe after college. And it's funny, you guys being skiers will love this. So Alpine Meadows is right next to Squaw Valley. And back in those days, this is like 96. Squaw was where the Olympics were. It's the more flashy-ish sort of Tahoe resort, where its neighbor Alpine, didn't have as many chairlifts. It was more like a locals mountain. There's no village there or anything. And just kind of a core ski place. And the first year I worked there was the first year they allowed snowboarding, right?
Uh-oh.
And so my job, I applied for this what I thought was a cool position. It was the director of mountain host program. And so the mountain host was a department at the resort of 12 people. And we had certain jobs. It was to kind of like Scott's fish phone. We one of us would sit in the booth and answer the ski phone in the morning. So you got to be there at like 6. So that job wasn't super awesome. And then another one was basket check, right? Also not very awesome, except because, wait till you hear the best job. Basket check. The only good part about that is sometimes you end up with a sweet pair of goggles or something that no one claims, and some, the gapers forgot it and they went back to the Bay Area. So sweet, I got some goggles, gloves. The other one was ski check, right at the ski corral. And so kind of a dangerous place, because you'd have like crazy out of control snowboarders and skiers crash into it sometimes, right? Because it was right at the bottom of a super steep groomer. And then the best job was riding or skiing around and interviewing people on chairs, right? So you jump in the chairlift, you got your fancy mountain host Alpine Meadows jacket on, and you got your clipboard, and you shred all around and ask people these certain questions. And so the main question at the end was, what would you change at Alpine Meadows to make your experience better? And I'd say 70% of the skiers I interviewed say, get rid of these goddamn snowboarders. And I'm sitting there next to them with a snowboard on, right? And I'm like, why? They're out of control. They're just out of control. And they snowplow down the powder runs and this and that. And I'm like, I see skiers do that too that don't know what they're doing. I think we can agree that somebody that shouldn't belong on a beautiful, fresh powder bowl that's plowing their way down there probably, needs to have better coaching as to where they should go. So as you two plankers, you probably would say, get rid of these damn knuckle draggers or something back in 96 as well. But Killer Mountain, awesome documentary. And Larry, he was there he was my boss basically. And it was a cool mountain. Now Squaw Valley and Alpine are under the same giant ski resort, like a lot of the ski resorts, at least in the States. They're owned by these giant corporations, and lift tickets are crazy expensive, and 30,000 people go to the resorts, and it's just not the same. Scott and I skied together at Whistler before.
Yeah.
Remember that?
The Brian goes, I got this buddy coming up, Dax. He wants to go up to Milton. We went up to Blackcomb and ripped it up. I skied yesterday for the first time this year. I'm kind of feeling it today, but it's just been such a slow start to the year. And on the weekend, we had a massive dump, and my son was with me. And there's no way I'm going to Whistler on a Saturday on the biggest storm of the year.
Right.
But anyway.
Like fishing, we pick our days better now instead of going every single day like I'm sure we all did when we first moved to a ski town. Every single day you go, right? And now there's no way, right?
Well, when I lived in Creekside, you just go rip for a few hours. It was almost like going to the gym. I would get up, I'd walk to the lift, I'd go for a few hours and just rip groomers and then go home and do whatever I was doing. And now living in Squamish and having a pass, there's always this pressure to get enough days on your pass that it wasn't a waste of money. But, my girlfriend who just left, she's also an old Whistler girl. She's a total snob. She never wants to go unless it's a big day. And I'm like, you're going to spend an awful lot of money on a pass for no days if that's your criteria. But, such as skiing, actually, I'm just sitting here talking with you guys about, Spey rods and casting and steelheading. It makes me want to string up a rod and just go down to the Squamish. There's probably not a steelhead to be seen for another month, but I just want to go now because just discussing it makes me kind of, hey, I want to go out and stretch out my arms, so to speak. The funniest thing is that's when you actually catch one. If I actually go hard to catch one, get up at 5 a.m, it doesn't happen. But if I decide to go down for an hour and walk the dog and make a few casts, I'll catch one and be amazed. And then I'll be there every day for a month, try to catch a second one.
It's funny, right? Because it's about location a lot of times. And what I mean by that, Scott, you talked about living in Creekside. For people that don't know, Creekside is one of the base areas for Whistler Blackcomb. And if you live there and you're a few minutes away from the chairlift or gondola, you're pretty easy to go out for a few hours. If you're a steelheader and you live in a place like Squamish, you could be in the river 15 minutes after we're done this podcast. And I mean, by the time put your waders on, the whole bit. There's a certain level of comfort I personally get knowing that my waders are hanging outside my front door and my rods are rigged. And if I wanted to, I could literally go fishing for half an hour. Man, I love that. And, I too lived in Squamish for a while and it still remains one of my favorite rivers. It is big water winter steelheading. It's a wide, shallow river. Fish quality is off the charts. A photo of the Squamish, the river itself, the valley, is very similar to the Dean, the setup, and the quality of fish, very similar to the Dean. And, the people that get to fish that river on a daily basis, if they want, are well positioned to encounter the best fish they could ever hook. So I think, for Squamish, the funny thing, and I mean this with the greatest respect for our friends who live in the city, but the thing about the Squamish that I always got a kick out of is that Vancouver crowd, Scott. They're waiting to call that fish phone and find out that the fish are in and that fishing's good before they make the drive up. But if you live there, you look at the freezing level, you look at what the river's doing, and you go, looks like it's going to be pretty good here pretty quick. And then you just go out there and a lot of times have the place to yourself.
There's a high tide at 6 a.m. and my chances are pretty good. I might even catch one. The last couple of years, the funny thing about the Squamish is the guys I know have had the most success have had it at the time of year when it's supposedly they're not around yet. So it is something to be said for you don't catch fish sitting on the couch. You got to go and put your time in. And but I liked it last year. I went quite a bit. And I just enjoyed walk the dog, go fish for a bit in the spring, and work it out. And it's funny because people think you live here that all you do is put fish on the beach. And actually, funny, when I lived in Creekside, I think I fished the Squamish more than when I lived in Squamish, just because it became more of a day. And let's face it, back then my job wasn't quite the same, so I had more free time to, run down to the river for a while and hook up the boat and make a day of it.
Do you ever see any of those bobber watch and bead chucking so-called fly fishermen on the Squamish?
No. Well, what's happened on the Squamish the last few years, and it's a bit COVID driven in that, the valley has become so busy because it is a big area close to a big metropolitan area and people want to recreate, even now, early January, you go up the Squamish Valley, you and I, Brian, we'd compare the traffic to like the peak steelhead season, 10, 15 years ago. There are just people up there and they're up there doing whatever it takes. And a lot of guys fish beads for, char in the bull trout and what have you. And flesh flies. That's the other thing. Flesh flies is the other big fly. So when you do go out for a day, or if you do a guide trip, as I occasionally do, it's not quite as easy as it used to be because the fish get fished. And that's where you see a lot of the bead becoming the big thing with fly anglers anyway. Now, obviously, I've never seen it in our steelhead season. Above and beyond, somebody fishing with an egg-sucking leech type of looking fly. Not like I saw in the Bulkley, where there was a 2-week window there where, as you know, Brian, the pinks are spawning and you can't get a fish to look up. And if you don't put on the round spherical object, your success rate is about 1% of what it would be when you put on the damn thing, and everything that conversation entails about, beads. And, I remember getting put on the hot seat by our good friend April there about it, and just everything about beads and steelhead and what are we doing. And, it's a very polarizing topic. Remember you, Brian, you were advocating we should have a ban on it. But, guys wanted to ban the pink worm on the Kispiox because they saw guys catching too many fish with it. So it becomes if everybody's fishing that object, that's what catches all the fish. And I remember when, string leeches on the Kispiox was the big thing, and everybody fished a huge string leech. And, there was guys grumbling about that. And I think the problem with the bead is that it's a plastic bead. And it really takes away from the ethos of fly fishing and just the whole thing about it. And then it morphs into split shot and strike indicators and that style of fishing like you see down on the Olympic Peninsula. But we've never really encountered that here, or it hasn't gone that way, the way I've seen down in Washington State, where they've actually moved to ban, guys fishing from the boat with beads and indicators because, for a variety of reasons, but, certainly polarizing.
So would you say the problem isn't necessarily the bead, but rather the bead fisherman?
I think it goes back to the mindset, guys who just want to catch as many as they can. I mean, when we were guiding, and it was that week or two, and I worked with guys who guided in Alaska and had no qualms about putting a bead on if that's what it took to catch fish. But some guys would limit it. A guy would catch a couple of fish and they'd be like, okay, let's move. You caught a couple. So we could see the fish. They didn't want to bite your flies, your dry fly, your egg-sucking leech. Okay, we put on a bead. You caught 3 right away. Let's go. And some guests, they almost felt shameful of it, and they would go. They go, yeah, let's go somewhere else. I got the Jones taken care of. I got my fix. Then there were guests that didn't want to leave, and it was a bit like I watched Lord of the Rings, over Christmas with my kid. It was very much Gollum and the Ring and My Precious, and they were just mesmerized by how many fish they caught so quickly, and they couldn't leave. They wanted to stay. They wanted to pound them. They wanted to get 20. And those same guys at the lodge would tell everybody in the lodge they got 20. And it was a problem. And it just got out of control. And it became very polarizing, in the lodge. If some guys had no problem doing it and they saw it as an avenue of getting a bigger tip, catching more fish, and other guys that said, do what you have to do to catch a few, but, where do you draw the line? And it really, I think, is angler driven. Some anglers, a good day is as many as I can possibly catch. And other anglers are, hey, I caught a couple the way I wanted to catch them, not the way, which would catch the most, and that's what I encountered, in our fishery. But since then I haven't had to deal with it, the same way. But I sure saw it. I mean, I saw when the bead was steelhead when it was stupid. 10 fish chasing your fly across the bottom 20 feet trying to eat it that wouldn't even look at anything else. You just saw the fish were just hypnotized by the damn thing. So, it was very challenging. And we fished them on sink tips, short sink tip, and we swung them really. It was not the bobber lobbing split shot indicator style that I've since seen. But even out, in the wintertime on the Veta River and stuff, the fly guys, they swing flies. You don't see the bead. What's interesting is the soft bead has taken over the drift fishing market. So now when you go into a store, they've got a huge wall of soft beads. The plastic beads, passé. It's these soft beads in 100 sizes and colors, and the drift fishers fish them. And that's by far the most dominant bait now for a soft plastic for steelhead fishing.
Is it somehow less offensive if a guy's fishing a bead under a float? At least he's being honest with himself and he's float fishing versus a guy fly fishing with an indicator bead setup, Dax?
I mean, from the root of it, it's called fly
Yeah.
fishing. So you could throw all the plastics and pencil leads and stuff all over that and put a fly on the bottom, and then it's fly fishing if it's a fly. So on the river that's closest to me, the Rogue, where I could go fish in 15 minutes, we have a fly fishing only time of year for a couple of months. And even the gear guys under a float will have greenbutt skunks and pheasant tails and copper johns, because those are all flies. And what we end up seeing is there's quote unquote fly fishing guides side drifting with their plastic bobbers. Some, you're not allowed weight. So they use the weight of these giant crazy bare hooks, and above them is a plastic or rubber bead. Nowhere in that description is a fly. Therefore, they are fishing illegally. So it's not just, I think that's a kooky, lame way to fish. It's also against the regulations. And I've talked to game wardens in California about it, and Oregon about it, and Washington about it, and Alaska about it. If it's fly fishing only somewhere and you're rocking a bare hook, that is not fly fishing. You're fishing illegally. And we could just leave it at that.
So, Dax, I remember, maybe some of the people listening attended or were familiar with, in Squamish, we used to do this let's call it a fly fishing festival. It was called Cast and Blast, and it had a variety of presenters. You guys both presented. Thank you for that. And a bit of a social component to it as well. And one of the highlights, Dax, was a slideshow presentation that you did, which contained your own unique element of humor. I don't know if it was good for generating guide business or not. I literally only had one complaint, but you were pretty hard on the bead fishermen in that presentation. And it's nice to see your opinion hasn't really changed. If anything, I think it's fortified. But do you have any fun stories about interactions with bead anglers or other guides fishing that way?
I don't know if they're fun. I try to just, there's talk of having some bead police on some rivers, because the game wardens, in order for them to write a ticket, they have to catch you in the act of landing a fish, which, depending how far away the bear hook is from the bead, it's likely hooked outside of the mouth, which is also illegal in a lot of places. And in places like Alaska Moraine Creek, where the most common way to fish is it's fly fishing only, but what you do is you just tie a couple whip finishes on your bare hook that you're going to snag the fish with, and you call it a midge. And you tell the game warden, "No, I'm fishing the midge." And the warden looks at the bead and he's like, "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Again, like, when you have to get that low, maybe you should reevaluate the way that you're fishing and the tackle that you're fishing. I think you're mining for one of the favorite photos in my presentation, and I'm giving that same presentation tonight, Year of the Nomad Angler. It's been edited over the last 15 years or so. There's less offensive stuff in there, I guess, but there's a funny picture of a drift boat with a toilet seat zip tied to the webbing of the seat. And this is a good buddy of mine, and he's not a bead fisherman, but he's the kind of dude, classic. It was his first year guiding, and we're in a guide house, and there's like a half dozen of us. And he had a really nice brand new drift boat that he would cover every night. And everybody could do whatever they want. I don't want to sound old and crotchety, but when you're a new guide, maybe your program shouldn't be racing every angler down, every guide down there. Maybe, not be quite as chompy, but he was pretty chompy. And I'm like, I looked in the garbage and there was a toilet seat. A bigger guy at the guide house sat on it and broke it. And I look at the toilet seat and I think of his drift boat. I'm like, I've got some zip ties in the truck. So I sneak outside, in the middle of the night with another couple idiot guides, we've got too much time on our hands, too much beer and whiskey. And we take his cover off and we zip tie the shit out of that toilet seat to his webbing on his rower seat, put the cover back on, nothing to see here. And we go about our business, go to bed. And then, so he comes home that night and we're expecting him to we didn't want to know what to expect, if he was going to flip out, if he was going to laugh. Again, RMF guide, for those of you that don't know or haven't been in certain guide houses, an RMF is a rookie motherfucker, and you just got to take some shit sometimes. That's the nature of the business, And this guy was way older than me. I was pretty young at the time. Yeah, he was older than me. And so he didn't have to look around too far to guess who was behind this caper, and we're just kind of holding back laughter, seeing how he's going to react. And he does open a beer and he looks at me and he's like, if it was just 1 or 2 zip ties, like that wouldn't have been that bad, but like, did you have to put like 20 of them on there? Do you know how long that took to cut those all off of there and to get in the boat and start rowing? And like, we're like, okay, tell us about it. And he's warming up to it. And he's like, yeah, I get there and I'm first and I back up to the water and I take the cover off and I didn't see it as I'm taking the cover off and my clients just start busting out laughing. And I look and I see it and I'm like, oh, all right. And I go and he's like, and then when he saw like how bad it was, now other vehicles are coming and they're like, oh, here's this rookie dude ready to race everybody downriver. And he had to pull his boat out of there and like move it, and took him, he said, 20 minutes to cut all the zip ties off. And I did him so tight that, he had to do it carefully or else he'd cut the seatbelt wrapping on his drift boat. So if that's the story in the photo you were talking about, there it is.
What I love about that story, Dax, is as a guide, you've got a plan, and you disrupted this gentleman's plan in a humorous way. You put him off his game perhaps a little bit. Some folks might have just hopped on that toilet seat and rode away and dealt with it later and worn it. It sounds like this gentleman decided it was more important to get back on his plan and cut that thing off and get rid of it. But it's a great story and it's a great slide. And what I loved about your slide presentation is the element of humor. As fishing guides, we can fall into the trap of taking ourselves too serious, and because we're so-called experts. But it's great to it's great to recognize that to the outsider, this whole steelhead thing must look pretty stinking ridiculous. Spending all this money, all this time, very occasionally getting a bite, sometimes landing a fish, wearing all this gear, getting real passionate about all this stuff. I have this thing where I say one fish changes everything. Some person catches a steelhead, they decide this is their thing. All of a sudden, relationships, jobs, responsible decision making is just by the wayside for some of us.
Out the window. Yep.
So client-wise, I don't want to beat up the clients too much, but Dax, tell me something about what a client can do to absolutely drive you crazy, and not in a good way. I mean, like what do they do that could infuriate you?
I don't like when my vehicle's disrespected, studded boots, not making an effort to step in without scratching the crap out of my running boards and the paneling, and shoving their coffee cup just somewhere where I don't find it till later, and it had coffee still in it and spilled. Or I don't like people that drink Diet Coke, drink like a quarter of it and then put it back in the cooler and it turns over, and then now my nice Yeti cooler's filled with sticky, nasty Diet Coke, which isn't good for you anyway. Yeah, so I don't bring I don't bring any soft drinks on the boat anymore. I bring water, and I encourage people to bring their own water bottles. We're filling up enough landfills with plastics and whatnot. So, yeah, people wasting stuff, I guess. As far as the fishing part, everybody does kooky stuff, and that doesn't really annoy me at this point because I've seen, not at all, but quite a bit of it, and I try not to get really annoyed at that. Maybe if they say something about like, oh, I was with so-and-so in this run and we did this instead. And, it's kind of annoying, but once or twice I'm like, maybe we'll try that a little bit different. You realize the tip you're saying will be maybe 2 inches deeper or shallower. We're not doing much different. So anyway, name dropping, I guess, is what that is. But
how about you, Scotty? Anyone ever do anything that annoys you when you're guiding?
Cleats, man, cleats in a boat. My jet boat, had like so many jet boats, it's kind of got this vinyl wrapped plywood floor. And I remember this one particular guy, I guided him for years. And, he'd get in the boat and he had this habit of like twisting his feet when he'd get in and out. And he fucking tore the shit out. Pardon me. He tore the hell out of my boat's bottom. And I kept telling him, hey, quit doing that. Like, do you golf? Do you walk on the putting green that way and twist your feet when you walk, trying to, and I end up having to put heavy rubber down. But it just so annoyed me because I felt that it was just, he didn't care. Jet boat was a tool. He's paying me this money to take him fishing and he could do it the heck if he wanted. It did drive me a bit nutty. Of course, the other thing, of course, is when you lend gear to people for whatever reason and they get a fish and they toss the rod and reel like you lent them, on the rocks like a discarded stick so they could pounce on their 4-pound fish that's on the rocks flopping below them, and yeah, I just always sort of shake my head. And we didn't lend out a lot of gear, but when you did, you like people who respected it. And then the final thing that killed me is listen to your guide. Don't ask me what you think you should do. And then as soon as I tell you, do something opposite or start arguing with me. If you ask me what tip I should put on, I said, I think this water calls for a type 3. And you say, no, I think it calls for a type 8. And you hang up your favorite fly in your first cast and break it off and get mad at me. I'm going to look at you and go, why do you ask me what to use when you already have your mind made up? And that kind of second guessing of your guide used to drive me a little bonkers. But I invoked the 3-time rule. If I told you 3 times, I wouldn't tell you again.
It's a good one.
And that was it.
You're very generous, Scott, because I won't say the gentleman's name, but there's a very well-known old-school steelhead fly fishing guide. Honestly, one of the early generation of steelhead guides. And I remember him telling me he tells clients advice once. And if they're not smart enough to take it, then they're on their own. So 3 times, they got lots of opportunity. I bring this stuff up because I think for folks listening who are going to hire a guide, if they're new to it, there perhaps are some stuff that they should go into it with to get the most out of it for themselves. And obviously what I'm hearing from you is if you're lending gear and you show up and the boat's nice and the truck's nice, you want people to respect your stuff. Sometimes for me, it's the little things that drive me a little crazy. I have this funny pet peeve and I'll blame the British because it's often anglers from the UK, cologne on the river. I don't want to stand next and smell that. Ugh. But it's really prevalent. I don't know why they do that, but a lot of Atlantic salmon fishermen spray that stuff on. And it's like, man, what are you thinking?
Yeah, you're fishing. Well, you mentioned English, and I have a lot of very dear English clients that I really enjoyed my time with. But man, the one thing they did that drove me crazy is they'd stand there with their rod almost vertical and barely a bend in it.
You mean with a fish on?
Fish on and fight a fish. And because this is audio for people listening, it's hard to say, but if there was, an ability to relate a visual, it was like they were holding a flagpole in a parade, straight up, 2 hands, and they would crank the reel and the rod would maybe, have a bit of a bend in the tip, and every time the fish pulled, they'd let the line run. And, our goal was to get the fish in and get them off and get another one. And you couldn't tell them anything. I mean, like, hey, drop that rod, point it reel, like let's beach this thing. And some of them had this very, and they loved it. They were in their glory, but man, it was so painful. And God forbid they get, share a boat with somebody one day that they maybe didn't come with. And I did have that where you had a guy who really fought fish the opposite way, down and dirty, and had him on the beach fast. And, you think these guys would learn, but no, this was just the way they did it. And it would drive me crazy.
Scott, I just want to clarify for people listening. When you say on the beach, this is sort of a slang. You're actually landing fish in the water. Yeah.
When the fish is near shore. I mean, when I was guiding, we used nets. We had nets in the boat all the time. We didn't beach fish. We netted fish for a variety of reasons. And but I grew up beaching fish, and we've all probably seen way too many steelhead flopping around on the dry rocks on the beach. But yeah, the term is just getting the fish to shore, or you're standing there with your net and you're knee deep in the water. You can see the fish and you're just trying to tell the guy just to reel down and just lift, pull him to the boat. And the guy's just standing there looking at you with his rod like a flagpole. And he said, I'm pulling. I'm like, no, you're not. We had all kinds of funny jokes, in the flavor of Dax's sense of humor. My favorite one was telling the guy to hit it with his purse. Like, come on, man, like pull on it. And some of these guys, they had tarpon fished. They'd fished the Seychelles for GTs. They know how to pull on a fish, but when it came to the 2-handed rod in a salmon in a river or steelhead in a river, they adopted this technique, and I just could not ever understand it. So, nothing more frustrating. Watch a 7-pound steelhead pinwheeling in the current 4 feet from the tip of your net, and you just can't get them to close the deal. But minor things, but those are definitely a few things that got me. And then, if you could probably build on that. Guys that move too slow, particularly for summer run fish, the joke, you got your foot stuck in the rocks, mate, or what's going on? Because they're just not moving through the pool, so that you can move on. They just seem to think that they needed to stand in one spot too long. But generally, if you level your humor at them in a way that, I think it's diplomacy is the key, right? I remember a guy, Dax, you ever cross paths with a guy in the States there named Tyler Thomas?
Doesn't ring a bell.
He had a business card that always made me laugh. And he guided on the Bow River when I was a kid, but he was an American fella. And his business card said, Tyler Thomas, abuser of wealthy yet marginally skilled anglers. And I just thought, when I was, 20 something, I just thought that was so risque, to say that, you're an abuser of
I love it.
But, it was done with tongue in cheek. And if you can diplomatically kind of relate to people that you want them to do something differently and they understand the reasons why, I think you can get away with it. I mean, God knows tarpon guides in Florida have been notorious for being the biggest assholes on the planet for decades because you're paying them big money to get big fish. And their attitude is that if you're not listening to me, you're not going to capitalize and you're not going to achieve the success you're paying me to help you do, then listen to me and do what I say, but they do it with a level of the abuse level. And it's there's stories written about it, and I've heard it when I've been flats fishing in Florida. I've heard guides in other boat yelling at their guests like, "Oh my God, are those guys friends or are they guests?" Because just profanity and when the guy blows a cast, making fun, just horrible. And, but I've also guided with tarpon guides that are just very patient, understanding, and they know to put you in a situation where your ability, is maximized. Don't make a guy cast 80 feet if he can only cast 40 feet, right? So, that comes without saying. That's just a guide making a good read on his guest.
I've got one more thing about. I used to do a presentation at the Sandy River Spey Clave where I would dress up like Moses and do something called the 10 Commandments of Spey. And it's instruction based. And if you do some searches online and YouTube, I also did it for a cool event, Rogue on the Fly, which is here in Southern Oregon in September, where I also did the Moses getup. So if you look that up, then you'll see some more detail about both things that annoy me, but also things, if you follow the commandments, you're probably better off as a Spey angler.
Nice. So we will include a link to some of that in the show notes for folks checking out our website, Dax.
Cool.
So they'll be able to find you there. I think a big part of it is to recognize when you're a guide that the person in front of you is not always going to be someone who has had the opportunity to do a lot of casting. They might not be someone who's comfortable dealing with the wind that's in front of them. They might be, simply put, outside of their comfort zone. And to recognize that, as you guys just said, or Scott said, if the person can't make an 80-foot cast, why would you make them feel bad about it? Especially if we only need a 50 or a 60-foot cast. So as a guide, it's important to recognize the skill set of the person in front of you. And as a guided angler paying for money or paying good money for a trip, I think it's also equally important for them to communicate to the guide, hey, I'm a rookie. I really want some help with my casting, or, I want to work on skating dry flies. I really want to work on my sink tip game, to just communicate what your expectations are ahead of time to set yourself up for success. To me, that's a real important thing when it comes to that guide-client relationship. And Dax, I would absolutely pay you for your expertise, but enjoy the heck out of your humor, because I think that it is pretty hilarious, some of the stuff we see out there.
Thank you. And 100%, in all seriousness, when I do chat with somebody before a trip, I ask them honestly what their goals and expectations for the particular trip are. That way their experience is something that we're clear that I could provide to the best of my abilities in terms of the venue, the fishery, and all those things. Communication is huge. Don't just go on a trip because your buddy asked you to go. And if you're a buddy and you ask somebody to go that's not really interested in doing it, probably best to do it on your own. That way you get the most coaching and instruction on that trip. Luck, a lot of luck in steelhead fishing, but luck is where opportunity meets preparation. And from my guide philosophy, I'm trying to prepare people and provide them that instruction so they will be more prepared when the opportunities are out there.
Yeah, it's, when it comes down to it, we're selling access and opportunity. And for folks that are looking to go on a trip, regardless of whether it's any of us or someone else, doesn't even have to be steelhead related. I think that pre-trip contact is really important, and folks don't always take full advantage of it. In my position, I sell every single trip that comes through our lodge. And we do use some booking agents, but I do have a certain level of contact with every single person coming through. And some folks, we've had 15, 20 conversations before I pick them up at the airport. I feel like I know them. We're friends at that point. And having that level of communication prior to the trip ensures that the angler shows up with expectations in line with reality. It's also very helpful because the flies that they're going to pull out that they've been tying themselves, or the box they put together as they dreamed about this trip, is going to be relevant to the fishing we're going to do. They're going to show up with 20-pound maxima, or perhaps a comparable product from a different supplier, stuff that we're going to actually use. Scott, what are you fishing these days for mono? You using maxima, or you use something different?
I still fish maxima, for leaders, and even for my mainline mono. I still have a big box of mono from my retail days, and it's 15 years old, but it's perfectly fine. I've obviously tried a lot of spectacularly strong monofilaments. In the salt, obviously it's a lot different. Clarity is really important with mono, and hardness and fluorocarbon and everything else. But for steelhead, I'm still pretty much a 12 to 15 pound maxima guy for everything. Just what I've always used. I've never found leader as prevalent in success on steelhead fishing like I have with, trout fishing in a lake. I mean, I've watched the guy with the fluorocarbon tippet outfish the guy with regular monofilament 10-1. So there's no doubt about some of those things. But I remember guiding steelheaders that, when fluorocarbon came on and they wanted to fish fluorocarbon and they swore by fluorocarbon and were having fluorocarbon related issues, break-offs and stuff. They didn't catch any more fish than anybody else, but they were convinced that it gave them an edge.
Man, I'll tell you, I have been on Team Maxima for forever. And by Team Maxima, I mean just someone who uses it. They don't give me any free line. 20-pound Maxima on the Skeena has always been my go-to. But this year, I got shocked a little bit because Dax gave me a new product to try. And man, it stood up really well. And the stated breaking strength was crazy high. Haven't had enough opportunity yet to say if it's going to push the 20-pound Maxima out of the picture. But Dax, tell us a little bit about what this product is and what your experience with it's been.
So it's kind of like the shooting line. I was set in my ways with the shooting line I was using. And like you said, I've been Maxima since I started steelhead fishing. So I never thought I would switch to it. I was just comfortable with it. And so Non Products came out with this leader material called Zentai. And so basically it's fluoro-coated mono. So it has the benefits of both of those things. It's pretty supple. It's pretty stretchy. Great abrasion resistance. It knots super well. It doesn't have any memory when you pull it off the spool. The spool itself, we could all agree that Maxima spools are agonizing. Comes with a plastic thing and rubber band. And sure, you could get your 5X empty tippet spool and run it through there or whatever. There's all kind of different combinations we all use. But at the end of the day, that crappy Maxima spool, it's coming apart in your waders or in your bag. It's just agonizing. Where the spool itself for this tippet material, it's the first thing I saw before I tried it. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to buy some of that. Just because it goes on and off the spool so easily. Large arbor, but is in a nice size that fits perfect in your Sims wading, zip-up waders or your big pouches and your bags. And so I test, again, this stuff, I use it. So when I first got it, I used it all winter steelhead season. Basically, 10-pound diameter Maxima is the same size as our 26-pound rated Zentai. Your 15-pound Maxima, which is what I use for winter steelhead fishing most of the time, that's 34-pound, and it's the same diameter. And so some people will say, well, I don't want to rip my tip off. I don't want to rip my shooting head loop off. If you get a snag and your shooting head breaks at the loop you're using, switch to a different company, for God's sakes. I mean, I've hooked plenty of logs, trees, rocks, and I have yet to break a loop on it. I know how to break stuff off, maybe more so than your average angler because I'm out there a lot, and I didn't have any issues with this stuff. And often when you're by yourself, you hike into a place, you're not using a net, you're hand lining landing your fish in the river. And when you do that, I want the strongest material per diameter possible. So I fail to see how people can make an argument to use something that's less strong because they're scared of breaking their stupid sink tip loop. Aren't you scared of hand lining a 22 pounder in the back? I mean, yeah, I like strong stuff. I hand line a lot of fish, actually. There's times I'm away from the boat. When I worked with Scott O'Donnell and Mike McCune on the Grand Ronde for many years, and with them in Alaska, we don't use nets. We land the fish in the river. There's a skill and art to it. And I want to use the strongest connection between my sink tip and the fly as possible. And out of all the different things I've tried, this is the best. Because I would always go back to Maxima. Whenever somebody would give me something new to try, I'd try it, and I would always just go back to that comfort of Maxima. But I can honestly say that I've been using it, and it's worked for me. The guides on the Dean loved it. The guides who have used it on the Skeena love it. Epic Waters Anglers crew loves it. They're usually on the Bulkley, Haida Gwaii. We have the heavier strengths with our saltwater guys down in the Keys. They're loving it. So, and the shops and retailers that are carrying it haven't had anybody buy it and come back yet and say, I want Maxima instead. So that tells me that our point of sale and our retailers, they're shocked that it's taking the place of Maxima. So I don't want to sound too salesman-y on this, but it is what it is.
It sounds intriguing. Send me some.
I will, for sure, Scott. For sure. You got to try it, buddy.
Hey, the spool alone is next level for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always remember, I think, funny you mentioned Maxima, and we're so ingrained on it. And when I was in retail, anytime a guy selling new monofilament would come in and compare it to Maxima. Oh, I got this new stuff and it's Berkeley Trilene, or it's this, it's that. Oh, compared to Maxima again. And at the store I was at, they were a huge Maxima dealer. And what he didn't know is the reason we sold Maxima is we made a huge margin on it because we bought it in such numbers and volume. And that was half of our attraction. Sure, it was certainly good, but that was part of it. But I remember fishing on the Dean with the now late Jim Vincent. And he back then, that's when he had Rio, and Rio was mostly just doing Spey lines and stuff. It was a long time ago. But he had all this tippet that he was trying, and he was handing it out to us to try to get us to try it and commenting on Maxima. And I remember in particular, he gave me a roll of some stuff that was 20-pound test. It was an Australian company that was extruding it. It was about the diameter, about 10-pound Maxima, and it was strong. It was super strong on the pull. It wasn't as stiff. The diameter wasn't there from a fly turnover point of view. And he was using it and he swore by it. And I used it for a little while. I mean, but I got into my head that I was somehow using something too heavy, with 20. But I think that left, with braid. I saw the same thing with braid line. People's mindset of, as Dex was saying, you have something that's 25 pounds test strength with 10-pound diameter, that it would get in your head that, I don't need to be using something as heavy as that, somehow you think it's a unfair advantage versus think, no, and braid line's the same. I mean, 40-pound braid is, really thin. And a lot of people have a hang up on it because they think, it's just too heavy. I'm not giving the fish a fair chance. They don't realize it's not about that. It's about its diameter and it's different technology, right? You do want to use the strongest thing you can pull. I'll always remember one summer on the Dean when I had a spool leader in my pocket and I was retying everybody's leaders and tying fast, whip out 3 feet, loop both ends, tie their fly on, get them back out in the water and fishing. And we're catching the hell out of them. And then later, towards the end of the season, I realized that spool I was using was 25-pound Maxima. It was, we used heavy. We used 15 most of the time. And I just wasn't really looking at it. And I'd been grabbing the wrong spool. And it didn't mean anything. We caught lots of fish. It was sure easy to grab when you leadered a fish, but it didn't really mean anything. The only time I saw leader tippet and pull strengths make a difference sometimes was when I discovered, Dax mentioned guys pulling loops apart. What I just had a lot of guys who like to fish small hooks. And I found that small hooks, guys would open them up quite a bit because, just really heavy strength, and they're reefing on it, but they're using a size 4 hook, and the hook would open up. But that's pretty limited, scenario. wasn't a big deal.
So let's talk hook size for a second, because look, generally speaking, steelheaders, I think, care about fish. I think a lot of us are conscientious of the potential for catch release mortality and are always working to minimize the chances of that. And hook size is a big part of that conversation. Not the only part of that conversation, but it's something that comes up, and it's certainly something that we can adjust easily. Scott and Dax, do either of you have any strong feelings about hook size as it relates to catch release mortality on steelhead or really any other swung fly fishery?
Well, I mean, since I left off, I mean, I almost religiously fished a size 2 hook in the, in tube flies and in, stinger flies, intruderish kind of things. Used a size 2 hook for a lot of fishing on the Bulkley. I used a number 1 on the Babine, and I used a number 1 on the Dean. I never got bigger than that unless we're fishing for Chinooks. And then we fished, I found for me on Chinooks, the happy hook was usually about a 2.0, maybe a 3.0. In the latter part of my guiding career, I started using OPST hooks. I was selling OPST as a rep then, and they had come out with that hook. And it's a weird thing. It's about 1 wire size heavier, right, for the hook size. So like their number 3, the wire on it is about the diameter of a normal number 2, but a smaller gap. And I like that hook. That was a good hook. I could use a little bit smaller hook. And my reason for it was, we talked about at the outset about hook sets. I just found that a smaller hook hooked up more fish with guys who were not, as dialed in on their hookup technique. That a fish come up and turn on a size 2 Gamakatsu or an owner, hook and would hang themselves. They weren't trying to drive it home. I remember guys Chinook fishing on the Dean that were using like 3 and 4.0s that were losing tons of fish because they weren't getting the hook in. The hook would just catch, the fish would run, they wouldn't drive it in, and the fish would run out a bunch of line, turn, come off. And we dropped hook size, and they started landing or hooking and landing a lot more fish without the risk of bending hooks open. And that was just my experience. But I was going to add, you mentioned our eras. The last decade, 15 years, I don't think I've fished, apart from a dry fly, I haven't fished a conventional fly, steelhead fly. Everything's a tube, maybe a stinger style, intruder style. But I like tube flies, and I fish that a ton. So my hooks are always small, short shank, type hooks. And I just noticed that the ratio of landing fish went through the roof when we switched way back in about when? Late 90s.
Do you buy into the idea that they're easier on the fish, those short shank hooks?
Yeah, they always seem to hang up in the corner. You don't hook fish in the tongue as well. Not that it doesn't happen, but very less frequently. Yeah, they just seem to be better. The leverage factor. I remember catching a really nice steelhead on a 2.0 Spey fly. Beautiful Lady Caroline. I was fishing on the Bulkley, and I just remember coming in, the fish, it had it in the tongue, and the fish was bleeding, and I was aghast. And I think that was the last time I fished a conventional hook fly. And I love Spey flies and that style of flowy fly. But, I became so conscious of what the hook damage could be. And I've been a big rallier against overly long stinger hooks on intruder style flies for a long time. That whole thing in my view anyway, got way out of hand. People lost sight of why you use a stinger hook on an intruder style fly and what the benefit was. And guys, the hobo Spey and stuff like that the thing hung back there really far, and, the fish had inhaled them, and you just saw so many poorly hooked fish.
So you're talking about a shank fly with a long trailer and a small hook, a couple inches back or what have you. Yeah.
I always say that the loop should be only long enough to change your hook. That's the idea.
That's right.
And not way back there. And I see them tied commercially. I've written letters to companies saying I think it's irresponsible to sell that fly, because people don't know. And, I love the hobo Spey. The Solitude hobo Spey is a great fly, but it was tied on Waddingtons, and we would cut the loop off and we would rig them like an old intruder with a piece of tubing and re-rig them. Or with those things, you used to be able to take the hook off and wrap the loop through the eye of the back of the Waddington a few times to shorten it, and then put the hook back on, and it would pull it up, just from observation. And of course, a tube fly, you just jam it in the back of the tube. It's not a problem. So that's been my take on it.
Yeah, 100% with Scott. Winter steelheading on the Southern Oregon coast, or if I'm up north or NorCal or OP, I'm size 2 generally. I've used those OPST3s. I think I'm out of them now. I like the new Aquafly. I believe it's called a swing hook. And same thing, I'm usually using intruder type stingers or tube fly stuff. I do fish some harrowing stuff. It's usually when clients give them to me, or if it's a client fly that they want to fish, and that's summertime stuff, occasionally North Umpqua. And on the Dean, I use size 1s, Skeena 1s or 2s. That's where I'm at. And yeah, I've always been, I have a guy that ties flies for me, Scott Crosby, Inner Sanctum Custom Flies, and he'll whip out a bunch of flies for Leslie and I for winter. And he ties a great fly with that perfect, just big enough. It's funny, Scott, I said the same thing when I was telling him, what I wanted and kind of showing him. I just want that wire to be long enough for me to change that hook out. And that's the other great thing about the tubes and intruders. You got a fresh new hook whenever you need one, nice and sharp. If it's bent out a little bit, I put a nice fresh one on there. I don't know why people skimp on, hooks or whatever. It's like it's hard enough to hook them. I like a nice sharp hook, and I like good, strong leader material. And in trout fishing, I'm a leader snob. I do a lot of dry fly fishing in the summer. I'm always mending my leader, putting fresh stuff on there, tippet material and whatnot. Yeah, these are things you can control as an angler. So I think tackle's really important, and that's why I gravitate towards really good stuff.
Nice. Well, we're getting close to the end here, and I want to say, first off, thank you very much for joining me today. But I also want to recognize that the whole concept of In the Bucket is we're going to see people come back from time to time, and I'd love to welcome you both back for another chat. Scott, we're going to do an episode on the Thompson. I think I definitely want to include you on that. And Dax, I've got some interesting stuff coming up with some other guides down in Washington and probably involve you there. But before we get going, I got two things. First, I want you to each think of the very best tip you have for a client on the water, and I'm going to get you to share that with everybody. And lastly, I want you to tell everybody how they can find you online if they're looking for a trip on the Squamish or one of your hosted trips, Dax, or if they have gear or casting questions and want to reach out to you. So why don't we start with you, Dax?
You could find me at Daxfly, www.daxfly.com, and there's all kind of info on there, both on my hosted trips, club presentations, and just a way to get a hold of me, which is the best thing to do. I'm super happy to talk to anybody about all kinds of stuff, even if you're not fishing with me. I also have a little blog site. It's not up to date all the time, but it's called Spey Tribe. There's some interesting stuff on there, mostly conservation stuff, maybe some opinionated stuff that some people might not like, and that's fine too. And I've got an Instagram account like everybody. I'm not crazy active, but I like putting some pictures up, and you can kind of see some photos from trips on that. In terms of the most important thing for advice for a client, for spey casting, it's visual awareness. So many guys just look straight ahead when they're making a cast, and they have absolutely no visual awareness of what their anchor and or D-loop is doing. You will not turn the corner and progress as a spey caster until you look at that anchor / D-loop combination. And kind of like I said before, for newbies, being a lucky angler is being prepared. And so I believe in building skills, both for single-hand and two-handed casting. When I first got into fly fishing, I was attracted to the artistic nature of watching guys single-hand casting on the Truckee River. And I don't know how a lot of these newbies are getting into it just to catch fish. It doesn't make sense to me because there's a lot easier ways to catch fish than fly fishing. So if you're doing it, why not enjoy the casting aspect of it and look for moments and not numbers of fish, and look for fly fishing as an experience based instead of a numbers based. Go to the store and buy a fish if you just want fish. That's all.
Well, I can chime in on that. I mean, I totally agree with Dax says about spatial awareness fishing. My take a little bit different. I was just talking about looking at the river. And, one of the lost arts, I think, for people is reading water and understanding how to read water. And they never take the time to look at the water in front of you. One of the sayings we had on the Maurice was ankle deep in 20 feet. because guests would want to wade out to their tits and throw for the fences. And so many fish were on the beach, and so I always encourage guys to look at the water. I'd often explain water to guests, and I always found that it was really well received. They never had anybody explain the water to them and show them what you're looking at and why you're fishing there. Because I think that helped them understand it. And we caught so many fish with barely a sink tip or barely a leader out because I would tell guys, just flip it out. Particularly the more east was unique because the way the river was, a lot of fish were right on the beach everywhere. But even on the Dean, we caught so many fish close to shore, and telling guys just that. And I think it also is fish to your ability. If you can't throw it far, quit trying to put yourself in spots where a long cast is necessary. Let's put you, where you can't. What you can do is going to benefit you, right? That's going to be the best thing. We converted a lot of guys on the Bulkley that were trout guys to steelhead fishing. So they had these grand expectations of this thing being really hard. And we would dumb it down and say, no, let's just, put you at the head of the runs there, stand because you can only cast 40 feet. And we'll just put you in places where the fish are 40 feet or less. So getting people to read water, I think, is really a good tip for them. And it's shocking how many people can't, right? And it helps them. So that's a bit of a lost art. And it's never talked about. There's so much instruction out there on how far to cast and beautiful flies and everything else. But people, if you didn't tell someone to fish and you watched where they would go because that's where they think the fish were, it was remarkable. They didn't know, right? And so that was my biggest thing is reading water. But I love that spatial awareness. I know Brian, Dax, I used to tease Brian a little bit because he would watch his rod tip every single time. And I used to sort of tease him a bit and call him the Stevie Wonder of Spey casting because the way his head would swivel around, it was like Stevie Wonder at the piano. And it's because he's watching his tip, and he was always watching his tip to watch his load and keep his rod loaded. And he would teach his students to do that. And it was a huge benefit because it showed what he was doing. And I think that tells a lot about people not understanding. They just wildly throw their rod around, not having any idea what's actually going on. So that tip to them would help them understand. And I, to this day, will tell people, hey, it's okay to look. It's okay to look over your shoulder and see your D-loop. It's okay to see where your rod's at. They think it's like a rule break. Like you're breaking the rules. You're not allowed to look. And I'm like, you should look, right?
Yeah, I always get people, Scott, to be focused on that first foot of running line outside the rod tip, because if that stays taut, if that stays under tension, the rod's going to stay bent, the rod's going to stay loaded. So watching that bit of overhanging running line, what that does is it gives you a real visual for the timing, for how you're going to apply your power. So I appreciate you guys bringing that up. Scott, people want to fish with you, people want to cast with you. How are they going to find you?
So I'm on social media, just by my name on Crackbook there. No problem. On Instagram, I'm at my address, or my at is at Uliwan, which is ULIWON. Long story for another day on where that came from. But at Uliwan is my Instagram connection. I don't put a ton of stuff on there, but I'm on there once in a while. But you'll find me on Crackbook at my name. And then, the agency I work with is Woodside Agencies, which is based out of Chelsea, Quebec. That's usually not really relevant for people, but anybody listening, you're always welcome. I'm always open to questions. I get tons of emails and friend requests from these things. People want to ask questions, and I'm always happy to entertain them and do what I can.
Wonderful, guys. Thanks for joining me today. I always enjoy speaking with you. To our listeners, I appreciate you tuning in with Dax and Scott. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and photos from this episode. You can find these online at inthebucketpodcast.com. I hope that you consider joining us next month when I'll be speaking with Dano Pendergrass and Darcy Baca. These guys are both legendary snowboard and fishing photographers who love to fish for steelhead. So if you're into snowboarding, fishing, or photography, you're going to want to check out this show. Until then, I'm your host, Brian Niska, and I look forward to bringing you our next episode of In the Bucket.